The following program is made possible by Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
2019 is in the books, and 2020 promises to be one of those years we'll remember for a very long time.
We look back and look forward. It's a special hour-long edition of The Game, and the game is on.
Hi, I'm Kevin Mullen.
And I'm Mark Simon.
Welcome to a special year-end edition of The Game. If 2019 was full of turmoil and trauma, divisions and disagreements, what will 2020, a presidential year, hold for us?
To take a look back and try to look ahead to what might happen, we are joined by our friend and resident political expert, Melissa Michelson, political science professor at Menlo College. Let's plunge right in. Let's talk about 2019. This has been a really unusual year for politics, especially for an off year. Is that part of what we've learned from 2019, is that politics never turns off anymore, that it's every year is a political year?
Well, I don't know that 2019 was really different in that sense, because always when it's the year before a presidential election, it's a big year. It's almost like the presidential election cycle is a 2-year cycle. And we've always talked about the money primary and who's qualifying for the debates and what do the fields look like. So that part I don't think is actually that unusual, but I think the amount of politics that regular people are talking about and the breadth of topics, it's not just who are the Democrats going to pick to be the nominee, but of course everything that's going on with impeachment and a lot of other pretty hot political issues that are being talked about. So I do think politics is more on people's minds now than usual.
Instead of just the usual wacko geeks like us that are into it all the time.
It's not the term that I use, but you know, we're not normal people. We're interested.
If you could sum up the year's politics, I mean, a lot of people will be using the word divisive. Is that a fair word to describe the politics of 2019?
Yeah, it's been very divisive, very polarized, and I think in a way that is turning off a lot of people. So at the same time that they're very concerned and they want their team or their side to win, there's also a lot of folks feeling like, wow, politics is really unpleasant and maybe I'm going to turn it off. We had a lot of that immediately after Trump got elected, and I think there's been a bit of a resurgence of that where people are just like, the 3 years of the Trump administration have been too much. I can't take it anymore. It's stressing me out. Let me go do some self-care.
It is exhausting, isn't it?
It is exhausting, and I'm struck, though, by the media cycle and how these stories, I mean, impeachment is a huge story. History will treat it as such. But with the torrent of information that comes over our phones and over cable TV and so forth, it seems like the story goes away very quickly, and there's not much sustainability of the public's attention on what should be really momentous political moments. So all of this is happening in this very changing media landscape where social media, the 24/7 nature, I guess, and just the volume of information perhaps, it's sort of hard for a story to stick or a storyline to stick. And in the world of politics, if you want to try to message these things, it's just a constantly shifting kind of a landscape.
I don't know if I want to say it's purposeful, because it's hard to know if President Trump is what he does. You know, when he sends out 100 tweets in like an hour, you don't know if he's purposely trying to change the subject, because he is very good at changing the subject. But you don't know if he's doing it because he's purposely trying to change the subject, or he's just got the worst attention span of any president we've ever had.
Right. We don't know. We can't see inside Trump's mind. But
which would be an interesting view.
Which would definitely be interesting. But regardless of whether it's deliberate or a happy accident for him, it does, I think, help Trump that attention turns. On the other hand, it also hurts Trump because, for example, on the same day that the House announced the impeachment, they also announced this big trade deal.
Right.
And so where, he was trying, I think President Trump was trying to put more focus on that. Like, hey, here's a big win for America and America's workers that I just achieved, right? I got a better NAFTA. And that was just a couple days ago, and we already stopped talking about it. And so the very rapid shifting news cycle also hurts Trump when he has a victory.
Well, he is better than anybody I've ever seen stepping on his own story. I mean, he, in 100 tweets, talk about a lack of coherent message, other than this guy's obviously very upset about something.
Well, not just the 100 tweets, but the 6-page letter.
Yeah.
I think that dominated the news cycle for a cycle, whatever a cycle is these days, 12 hours.
Yeah.
But, it was printed in full in all the major newspapers with annotations, and everyone was talking about it. He did that to himself.
Yeah.
So we can't get inside his head, but you have to think on some level he knows. His obituary in the first paragraph, it says he was the 3rd president to be impeached, right? So, and clearly the torrent of tweets tells you it is in his head. How do you think he is viewing this? Do you think he's viewing this as an opportunity to really message against the Democrats and, in his words, overreach? Or do you think he knows that there's a permanent stain on his presidency and that ultimately these issues will be adjudicated at the ballot and he goes into 2020 election year in a somewhat weakened position? How would you think he's framing it?
What he's framing it as publicly is definitely as a fundraising opportunity. The messages that are coming out from the Trump re-election campaign are very much about how this is a good reason to send more money, right? Let's show those Democrats. And I think, as unusual as it is that we are impeaching somebody before an election, right? So if you contrast this with Bill Clinton, he wasn't going to be up for election again. And so I think for Trump, the fact that he very well might win re-election next year is a way for him to use this to show that it was all fake, right? So he maybe wants his obituary, or he wants the history books to show, yeah, he was impeached, but he wasn't removed, and in fact, he was reelected. And I think that's where he thinks this is going.
Some vindication.
That vindicates him. I mean, there's a strong possibility that he will be reelected, and then that for him, that's where he's going. So he's fundraising off of the impeachment, and he's messaging on this as this, witch hunt, et cetera. And that's what he's using to propel him towards this vindication at the polls next November.
So 2019, if we had to pick one event, I would think impeachment is the one that really will be what 2019 is remembered for. We're all the kind of people who watch huge amounts of the I don't want to call it a debate because it really was people talking past each other, but even the committee hearings and all the news conferences. What's your take on that? Is it something that will be a footnote in history? Is it something does it hurt him politically? And the country is very much divided on this, although the numbers, if you look at past impeachments, like with Nixon and with Clinton, where the numbers are, support for it is higher than it's been in past years at the same point in time. So
right, so there's like this disconnect that support for impeachment's pretty high, and yet we had the most partisan vote for impeachment that we've ever had. And I think that's a huge takeaway, because in the past, right, with Clinton's impeachment, we saw Democrats willing to say, yes, that was an overreach of presidential authority. With Nixon's impeachment, we had Republicans willing to do the same and willing to go home to their districts and say, yes, we're all Republicans here, but I couldn't let that stand. And this time there's none of that, right? There's a couple of outliers like Van Drew and Tulsi Gabbard, but everyone's pretty much towing the party line, and I think that's very unusual. You don't usually see, right? And so that's a big story of this impeachment in terms of how people were putting party first.
How did we get here? I mean, it's not a fair question because it's such a broad question, but I mean, I was a political reporter in this area for a long time, and there were Republicans and roamed freely around the countryside. Most of them were not Reagan Republicans, were uncomfortable with how conservative Reagan was, and most of them now are either independents or they're Democrats because they're really uncomfortable with where the party's gone. But this idea that not a single Republican can say in an honest and objective way, I'm really uncomfortable with what this has done, and a president, no matter who it is, shouldn't do it. And my experience is there are Democrats who would have, had it been a Democratic president, would have said, yeah, I don't care if he's my president or not. I'm not going to condone this behavior. What has happened to the Republican Party?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Are they so fully in the grips of Trump and how he dominates their party?
It's not just Trump. We can't put this all on Trump. And look at it from a Republican perspective. The Trump administration is delivering judges that are going to push back against abortion, is delivering tax cuts, is reducing regulation, is reducing all these restrictions on business, is tightening up the border and tightening up immigration and amnesty, which is, what in the Republican vision, keeping America more safe, making sure that jobs stay with Americans, is pushing back against China and making sure that, American workers get a fair deal. From the Republican perspective, the Trump administration is delivering on lots of things that they really care about. And so when you are, as a Republican member of Congress, as a Republican member of the House, supporting that president, you're also supporting all of those things that the Trump administration has delivered and said, yeah, okay, he's done this other stuff, he tweets a lot, it makes me uncomfortable, but in the end, I want that presidency. I want those deliverables for my party and my district, and I support what Trump is doing, and that's more important to me than this idea of impeachment over a phone call.
Which then you can then dismiss as purely politics anyway and not even policy.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we're coming up on a break. I just wanted to sort of float this, that we could discuss it after, but you have these two camps, Democrats, Republicans, polarized on Capitol Hill. But that's not necessarily representative of the American people as a whole. There are, we have 30% no party preference voters in California. People are moving to becoming independents across the country. There's more purple out there than you would think based on these partisan votes that are taken on Capitol Hill. And even the parties themselves, there's slices within the party. You have traditional Bush Republicans and you have Trump Republicans. You have, say, Obama, Clinton Democrats, and you have a tier which is Sanders Democrats, and then this swath in the middle, unaligned with anybody. So it's a much more nuanced, complex picture politically than it gets framed, but the dominant narrative becomes, look at these two parties and the war that they're engaged in politically. But it's not necessarily reflective of the country as a whole, albeit.
But the public has become more polarized.
Let me stop you there. We're going to have to take a break.
Sorry.
Look, if it's nuance you want, you should come right back. We'll be right here having more nuanced discussions. Stick around.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to the game. I'm Mark Simon. He's Kevin Mullen. Over here is Melissa Michelson. We're going to wrap up 2019 and then move on to 2020. And Kevin made a good point, which is there are more people probably in the middle than anywhere else, but the politics aren't about the middle. Some of that, I think, is how campaigns have changed, so that it's about that one sliver you can move one way or the other, depending on the issue, depending on how you frame the issue. I mean, I've covered campaigns where, somebody's running against somebody else, they characterize their opponent in a certain way, and that goal is not to get more people to vote for me, it's to get for people who might vote for my opponent to not vote.
Yeah.
Or if you're a Republican, say, on that Judiciary Committee, and you're in a safe Republican district, the only fear you have is being primaried from the right, by somebody even more conservative than you. That's how you might lose your job.
Yeah.
So you have to present yourself as, I'm pro-Trump, I'm rock solid conservative Trump congressman. So you have the extremes also sort of pulling these members to the extreme, which adds to that polarization and sort of a toxic mix.
Yeah. Well, we've talked a lot about Trump, about Republicans. Let's talk about the Democrats a little bit. what kind of year did they have? I mean, Nancy Pelosi clearly had a year. I mean, she ended up maybe the dominant Democrat on the scene in the middle of a very crowded presidential primary campaign. Here's this the speaker, and she is dominating the landscape, equal only maybe to Trump.
Yeah, she is probably the most powerful speaker we've had in a century, and I'm, no disrespect to Newt Gingrich, but she has got control of that chamber. Yeah. If you just saw her withering look at the caucus when the Democrats seemed about to cheer for impeachment on Wednesday, I mean, she is in control, and I think that's different, right? To see a strong woman in charge like that of a major branch of the federal government, I think that's a pretty big deal for 2019. And so maybe we're not going to have a woman president. I know we'll probably talk about that a little bit more, but we are seeing a woman at a very high position of power in Nancy Pelosi, and I think that's something. And obviously having a foil in the form of a president of the other political party helps, but throughout the past century, we've seen the power and the prestige of the speaker go up and down, and Nancy's peaking.
Yeah.
She's a master. I mean, she really is at the peak of her abilities, the maximum ability level right now, essentially training a whole life in politics for this moment. So she's got mastery of her caucus, mastery of the messaging, and is this true counterweight to Trump. And I mean, I've followed her career, her whole career, but have gained even more respect just watching her in the last 2 weeks and how she's been able to maneuver all of this. It's a remarkable job she's doing.
She's had 3 moments that really jump out from 2019. One is the clap during the State of the Union, where she, and that became a meme.
Right.
And unlike a lot of memes, it didn't bounce back on her. I mean, a lot of times something becomes a meme and you wish you'd never done it. Yeah. But in fact, it sort of built her base as a powerful woman. The meeting in the White House where she stood up and lectured the president, and then the "don't mess with me," that moment at her press conference. I don't think, other than the president, there's a single individual. Any one of our presidential candidates, the Democrats, would have loved to have had one of those moments, and she had 3. Which tells you she's somebody who knows exactly who she is and what she's about and what she's doing, which is kind of stands out in the landscape here.
Kind of stands out and is inspiring. And I think, again, to get back to gender, I think it really does make a difference when little girls see this very powerful woman standing up and controlling Congress like that, and standing up for the Democratic Party against the Republican president like that. I think that's a big deal.
Yeah. Let's talk about the presidential field of Democrats. We've had, I don't know how many debates now. We've had, God knows, 6 debates. I don't know how many candidates have been in and out, and more
50
are
bazillion,
in.
yeah.
And at the end of the year, where do the Democrats stand? Are they better off now than they were 4 years ago? Are they, is the field clearer, or is it still muddled? And is that cause for concern, or is that just the nature of things before there's votes cast, before there's a caucus, before there's a primary?
Man, these are big questions you got this morning.
This is 2019, and we're asking the big question.
So, on the one hand, we have no idea who's going to be the nominee at this point. Buttigieg is leading in Iowa, but Biden's still leading in the national poll.
And there's that sense that Buttigieg, even if he wins in Iowa, really doesn't have the staying power to get it all the way through, does he?
Well, if he gets enough momentum, right? If he wins in Iowa and that gives him momentum, and that somehow that means that voters of color, which is his big weakness, decide, okay, he really can win. He really is, Obama 0.2. Let's do this. Then yes, he can come out of Iowa and New Hampshire with the momentum and the potential to win. But there's a very real concern that because of the whiteness of the 2 early states, and because of the lack of support from communities of color of many of those leading candidates, that we can't be sure who's going to come out of Iowa and New Hampshire as the winner, right? Biden seems low on money, is 4th in Iowa right now, but he's still the big winner. And if he does well enough in those 2 early states, and then can go do very well in South Carolina and do very well in Nevada, then he's back to being the front runner. So it's very fluid.
So after all this, we're pretty much where we started from, which is that Biden's the dominant figure. We've got an array of other people who are interesting and may rise or fall.
But it is different because we did have last night 2 women on stage who were reasonable contenders. We had Andrew Yang on stage. We didn't have any Black or Latino candidates on stage, but they're still running, right? And again, if we come out of Iowa and New Hampshire muddled, if it's still anyone's game, right? If we're going to throw away, 50 years and say, look, this time it doesn't really matter, and what we want to see is who comes out of Super Tuesday, then it could be Deval Patrick. It could be Julian Castro. It could be anybody.
And the nature of those Super Tuesday states where you have to have 15% viability to accumulate delegates, the setup here really is for a more extended primary than maybe we've seen in a while, just given the number of states voting on Super Tuesday. And of course, California is not only a Super Tuesday state, millions of Californians will be receiving their ballots the day of the Iowa caucus on February 3rd. So we will be voting right along the same lines as Iowa caucus folks will be caucusing. So just given the nature of this sort of muddled field and the setup of the contests potentially leading all the way through the spring, does the potential exist for, say, like an Amy Klobuchar, somebody who's at 3%, 4%, sort of like John Kerry was at 4% at the same date back in 2004, and he wound up winning the Iowa caucus. Is there that opportunity still there for a lower tier candidate to break into that top 4, essentially, that have kind of dominated the media attention to this point?
Yeah. I mean, at this point in previous cycles, the person who eventually became the nominee wasn't in that top tier. So this has happened multiple times, and things are different this time. And so every time the party changes the rules, we can't necessarily look at history and say what's going to happen, but looking at the way they've changed the rules and the way it's set up this year with California and all these big states, I think it's still pretty wide open. On the other hand, though, you've got a Democratic electorate that's pretty concerned about winning. And so they don't want a process that goes all the way through the spring. They're worried that that means that they come out of the primary season weaker. And so I think there's a lot of kind of internal struggle in the party where folks want to pick a winner and they want to pick that person quickly so that they can pivot to winning the election against Trump instead of still working internally on picking who that person's going to be.
Well, getting back to Kevin's point earlier, the nuanced point, that they're more purple than blue or red. Are Democratic voters worried that if they pick somebody who's too far to the left, they'll pick somebody who can't win?
Yeah, and they're also worried that if they pick somebody too boring and moderate, that folks won't come out and vote. Yeah. So they don't know which way to go, because do they go with Biden, who seems like, he could get those moderate voters, he could get those purple voters, but maybe young people are not going to be excited, right? Or do they go with, Pete Buttigieg, but then, and that maybe gets a lot of other folks excited. But I could do this for any candidate, like any candidate.
Yeah, the thing about Buttigieg is interesting. He's a moderate, but picking him is a radical choice. You could argue.
So does that, right? But does that get the youth vote excited because, oh my gosh, this is a young person and he's, and he's openly gay and that's new and exciting and we want to help be part of that historic moment.
Yeah. We got a minute left in this segment. I want to ask, do you have a person of the year for 2019? Time Magazine picked Greta Thunberg. Trump was upset that it wasn't him. If you had to pick a person that really jumps to mind immediately when you think of 2019, who would it be?
Well, given our discussion of just a few minutes ago, I feel like Nancy's a pretty strong contender.
Yeah.
And just all of these memes that are like in my head of her with the red coat and the sunglasses and the clapping and with the look on, she's kind of like a political rock star right now.
She had a good year. Yeah.
She had a good year.
How about you?
I was going to go Pelosi. She stole my.
Well,
I just see her absolutely peaking right now politically and is a force. In fact, David Gergen, the all-wise David Gergen of Democratic and Republican administrations, said she should be the Democrats' candidate for president, that she has such an ability to coalesce people. I don't know if I go that far, but she really is a force and really is like kind of like, she talks about how Elijah Cummings was their North Star in their caucus. She is the North Star right now for the Democratic caucus, and engaged in this momentous battle here.
Well, I was going to pick two, and Kevin Mullen and Melissa Michelson. Stick around. We'll be right back.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to the game. I'm Mark Simon. He's Kevin Mullen, and over here is Melissa Michelson, Menlo College, political science professor. And we've been hammering away at 2019. We're going to try to move on to 2020. We're having too much fun here. One of the things that President Trump could claim as a success is the state of the economy. Now, there's an interesting question whether it's growth without prosperity. There are a lot more jobs, but people are having to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. But that being said, the stock market's great, and that's usually the first indicator people look at to decide if the economy is doing well. But everybody seems to think by 2020 we're going to have a recession, that there's going to be some kind of a downturn. I know you think that.
Well, let me, if I can amend that. Looking at the recent data, it seems as though the weakening is happening sort of nationally. We in California are not seeing any warning signs, which is remarkable. I mean, this recovery in California, and California is leading the economic growth for the country. You're not seeing a weakening yet. It's inevitable. We haven't done away with a business cycle, I don't think, but the question really is, nationally, do you see the numbers ebb and some of the hiring slow and sort of the traditional markers nationally that might even enter the conversation in the summer or the fall leading into the election? But there's a lot would need to happen economically for a downturn to somehow take hold to actually affect.
But what it says to me is, regardless of how good it is, there's a lot of apprehension about the state of the economy. And historically, in a good economic time, a president gets reelected, and I guess you could ask the question, why wouldn't a president get reelected if the economy's good? What's your sense at all of how the economy might play out in 2020 as a political issue?
I think it depends whether people feel like the economic stress that they're feeling is their personal responsibility, or if it's something that everyone's experiencing. And so if you are hearing on the news that the economy is doing well, jobs are being created, everything's great, but you're struggling and maybe you're working 2 jobs, the tendency is to think, well, that must be some personal failing on my part, right? Everyone else is doing okay, so it's not the government's fault that I'm struggling. Mm-hmm. If you start to think, no, the reason I'm struggling, the reason I don't have enough money to pay off my student loans, or the reason I have to work 3 jobs in order to pay the rent and to buy insulin is because of government policies, then it starts to hurt Trump's chances for re-election. Mm-hmm. And I think right now that isn't what people are thinking. They're thinking the economy's strong. They're getting that message over and over again. And so the folks who are struggling, who aren't feeling that prosperity, aren't putting that blame on the government.
Yeah. We've talked before when we've been together on this show about how much the country is changing demographically. President Obama famously said it was time for these older white guys to get out of the way, and Joe Biden promptly said, well, that doesn't apply to me. But looking forward to 2020 and the voting, what kind of electorate are we going to have, and how different is it going to be from what we saw in 2016, and maybe what we've seen historically over many, many decades in this country?
I think we're going to see huge turnout next year. I think both political parties are fired up, either to vote to support President Trump. Republicans are fired up to come out and vote for him, and on the Democratic side are fired up to not have him be president any longer. And so I think we're going to have huge turnout, and so that's going to mean that groups that have traditionally participated at lower rates are going to be participating, and that's
Such
young
as?
people, people of color, people with lower incomes. I think turnout is going to rise. The degree to which it rises, I think, is going to depend on who that Democratic nominee is, because there's different segments that are going to be excited by different potential nominees.
Yeah.
But the dominant factor, do you think, is the antipathy towards Trump? I mean, I'm of the same thinking that we're going to see turnout just blow through records.
Yeah.
And we saw a precursor in 2018 as a lead up to 2020, a little bit like when the Democrats took the House in 2006. It really was a preview of what was going to happen in 2008 when Obama got elected. I do think this is like a two-cycle kind of a phenomenon driven largely by Trump. But yes, whoever the nominee is, you have to have an excited base. But I think, I just have a feeling people are going to come out of the woodwork to vote in this historic election as a rebuke to Trump. You just don't want to do anything on the Democratic side to damage that or dampen that enthusiasm to get out and vote. And some of the folks that really maybe weren't on the rolls were infrequent voters that came out for Trump that didn't show up in the polling in the Rust Belt states. I think a lot of that's now baked in. The question is, on our side, the infrequent voters in Michigan and Wisconsin, folks that maybe vote at once every 3 presidential elections, the motivation among that infrequent voter class to come out and participate in this, I think that the likelihood is very high. So it's all unknown, but I would definitely say turnout is going to be through the roof.
Well, and it's interesting because we alluded to this earlier. There are a lot of people who think politics doesn't matter, whichever word, however you want to use the word. But I think one of the things about all the turmoil, all the attention, even the weariness that comes with it is people really understand that these things matter. They matter to them directly. Let's talk a little bit about the race for president. What would be the winning messages? What would the Republicans, what is likely to be the message of the Republicans and of the president? And if there's if you're the Democratic nominee, and we'd all be better off if you were, there's no question about it. But if you were, what should be the fundamental message the Democrats are delivering to the voters to win the election?
Well, if I knew that, I'd be making a lot of money as a political consultant. And I think what you're seeing, what you saw last night, is that each of the potential Democratic nominees has a different idea of what that message is, right? So Elizabeth Warren is saying it's about getting corruption out of politics, right? It's Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren talking about Medicare for all and how we've got to get down prescription drug prices. Everybody's got their idea of here's the winning message that is going to make turnout even higher than this already high threshold we're going to see, and is going to excite people to come out and vote for me. And I don't think anybody knows for sure what that is. Is it that we need to restore America's standing in the world? Is it that we got to make sure that prosperity is also trickling down to people who are working hard? Is it that we got to give everybody a guaranteed minimum income, right? Andrew Yang's prosperity dividend. I mean, everybody thinks they know what that message is. I have no idea what the winning message is.
My experience in politics is that you need to focus on 2 or 3 things.
Yeah.
The economy, security, whether people feel safe in their homes and safe in their communities, and education / the future. Can I provide for my family? Can I guarantee that my children have a chance for a better life than I've got? And whether we like it or not.
But now we've also got healthcare and climate change, which are maybe security.
Yeah, they qualify as security issues in the sense that, I'm going to make you feel better about the future.
Yeah.
Trump talked about those things in 2016. Whether we like what he had to say or not is a different question. Hillary Clinton did not. I mean, most of her campaign seemed to be, I'm not him.
Yeah.
And I'm better prepared than anybody else. When I think about the campaign, those are the things I think about. Who's talking about those fundamental issues that actually reach into somebody's household? And the president knows how to do that, no matter where he is.
Right. And what I would say, though, is you talked about Hillary sort of saying, I'm not him, and didn't necessarily offer a very clear-cut, say, economic message for the Rust Belt. But we've now had 3 years, going on 4 years, to see what Donald Trump is and how that has manifested itself into what is, an international embarrassment. So he's got a track record that he needs to run on, that the Democrat can properly contrast, the fact that they aren't Trump. But the Democrats' message, I think, will largely depend on who that nominee is, because the nominee has to sort of embody the message that they're delivering. It can't be just, straight poll tested, these 2 or 3 things. They need to be uniquely qualified to deliver that particular message in contrast to Trump. But I just think there's a lot of surface area to work with in terms of running an opposition to Donald Trump that frankly didn't exist in 2016. It was a very different dynamic. So I just don't know that looking at 2016 is frankly much of a good model or a marker for us to take into 2020. This is about firing the incumbent president.
Absolutely.
And the race will be about Trump, whether we like it
it's
or
not. It's a referendum on Trump. I actually say this to my students all the time. Every presidential election, every election is a retrospective election. So if you've got an incumbent, this is people looking at what the incumbent president has done. What have things been like those last 4 years? Do we want more of that, or do we want to try this other thing? And you can never be sure what that other thing is, because they're making promises. They've got policy positions, but who knows, right? Politicians lie. But that's a record.
Present company.
Not all of them, no.
Sorry. Whether or not it's true, that's what people think.
Gotcha.
Not always true. But
Fair
people
enough.
think you can't trust what the politicians are promising us, but we know what they did. We know what happened when they were in office. So they can look at the last 4 years under Trump and say, do I like what happened, or would I like something else?
So then, campaigns are always about controlling the agenda. The question is, how do you do that with this guy? Because he's so good at controlling the agenda and often taking it places that you never anticipated. Let's shift gears a little bit, or maybe a lot, to talk about some of the local issues that have been dominating 2019. And there are 3 that always seem to come up: housing, traffic, and growth. And they're all interrelated. Looking ahead to 2020, do you see any of this easing up? Do you think we've built enough? We've built too much? I've actually have anecdotes of apartment complexes that are offering discounts on rent, move-in bonuses, things like that, which you wouldn't have expected, given all the talk about the need for housing. I'm definitely worried that all this new office space is going to go up right in time for there not to be anybody to move into it. But that's just because I tend to be a worrier. But is there any reason to think that the local agenda isn't going to continue to be dominated by these issues?
I think it's the dominant issue is growth and jobs, housing, and balance, the amount of commercial development. My hometown of South San Francisco, Stripe, is moving out of San Francisco to South San Francisco, and it's being celebrated by city leaders, but that's thousands of new employees that need to be housed somewhere. So just the connection between job creation and how enough affordable housing and workforce housing is being created, and the price pressures that are being felt by everybody else as a byproduct of that. I mean, that is the dominant issue on council races, supervisor level. It certainly reaches up to the Assembly and the Senate level. We have an active Senate race, and I know those very issues are front and center for those candidates who are frankly trying to get a little bit of attention from the public in a presidential contest year, which is a very difficult thing for a state Senate candidate, for all of them to do. So that's really what's on voters' minds, is that traffic congestion, growth. What does this peninsula, what does our quality of life look like 5 years from now? Those kinds of things are dominant, I think.
The students you deal with on a regular basis, are they worried about the future, whether they can stay in this area? I mean, a fair number of them are not necessarily from this area, but are they worried, or are they?
Oh yeah.
They don't have youthful confidence.
They are worried about a lot of things. They are very worried about climate change. They're very worried about feeling safe, and they are very worried about the cost of living. And they don't. And Menlo College, personally, because we had so many students this year, we actually had to rent some apartments for students to stay in off campus, and so they can see, what it's like to live in an apartment in the neighborhood, and they know that that's not something that they're going to be able to do upon graduation unless they get a really, well-paying job. That the cost of rental housing, the cost of buying is insane. And so I think housing continues to be a huge issue. They also see, the homeless people around. They see the disparities in the neighborhoods in terms of wealth. So they see all of the problems just in this local area, and they are concerned about those things.
Homelessness seems to be one of those problems that nobody can figure out how to solve. I mean, I think some of it goes back to the years when Reagan was governor, and he closed a lot of the mental state facilities that would have, in a harsh term, would have housed some of these folks, but certainly would have provided a measure of treatment that a lot of them are not getting now. And on that cheery note, we're going to take another break. We're going to wrap up 2020 and move on to God knows what, but stick around, we'll be right back.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to the game. I'm Mark Simon. He's Kevin Mullen. Melissa Michelson is here. Well, as we ended that segment, we were talking about homelessness, and we talked a little bit off the air, and I want to continue that conversation because it is a tragedy. And you were talking about, we were talking about tent cities where there used to be state mental hospitals or state health facilities. Now they're tent cities, and they're trailers. And it seems like one of those issues that in 2020 people are going to expect somebody to do something about. And I guess the question is, I'm going to look at the state legislature.
That seems fair.
How do you even start?
Well, there is a statewide Blue Ribbon Commission that the governor put together, which is coming forth with a series of recommendations on how to deal with this issue, which, approaches to this point have been nowhere near the scale of the problem. So I've thought for a while now we ought to have a special session specifically on homelessness and a full-blown statewide coordinated strategy. It's just there are lots and lots of regional and local innovative approaches that are taking place. You want to get the results from those to see what actually works. There's the housing first approach. San Jose has done some very positive work in this regard, but there's essentially probably a list of like 20 things that need to be done with a mental health component, a public health component, a public safety component, but it isn't just resources, although resources is certainly part of the equation. But I think you'll see the governor he's got PG&E bankruptcy as a dominant issue, but you're going to see him, I think, take a robust leadership role with the leaders of the legislature, because this is the glaring failure of state government and county and local government, and certainly the affordable housing landscape lends itself to this problem as well. So needs a multifaceted response, but I do think we need a special session to deal with all of this and to raise the level of seriousness in the public consciousness on the issue.
One of the things I think that has happened in leading up to 2020, we're not really a suburban area anymore. We're more urban than suburban, in that we have urban problems. Mm-hmm. We have traffic problems. We have homelessness, which used to be sort of limited to the big cities, but now we see it everywhere on right-of-ways and under freeways. Let's talk a little bit about that and how the area is changing, because you spent a lot of time, not just in the classroom, but in some of the books you've done, studying social change, how it comes about and what leads to it and what it leads to. So is 2020 going to be one of those years we may look back on and think, boy, this is a year where a lot of changes that were coming kind of came home to roost?
Yes. I think 2020 is going to be a huge year at the national level and also the local level, because we really have these major issues here that we have to figure out, right? The traffic problem isn't going away. The housing and homelessness problem isn't going away. All of these things are just getting worse and are just draining on people. And so there's going to be some major decisions that have to be made in terms of what does the future of Silicon Valley and this whole neighborhood look like? Are we going to start doing these, taller buildings and integrating housing with transit, or are we going to continue on this NIMBYism, right? Are we going to continue to let people just park in trailers and mobile homes on El Camino? Or are we going to come up with a way, right, to put them in some kind of overnight area where there's security and restrooms and plumbing, right? So all of these things are really getting to critical points where decisions have to be made about what we're going to look like going forward.
The other change that seems to be taking place, certainly in California first, and maybe in the rest of the country, and it sort of was alluded to by President Obama, get out of the way. You could make a case historically that the politics of our time reflect the ending of an era in which white males dominated our political environment, and that they're being replaced slowly and steadily. I was struck when I was watching the floor discussion on the impeachment. The Democrats were incredibly diverse. Women, men, people of color, every kind of demographic that this country can present. The Republicans were all mostly middle-aged white guys. Is that maybe going to be one of the stories of 2020? We talk about the rising turnout, and you've mentioned people of color, young people. Are we going to see some of that change at play, you think, in 2020, that we're leaving behind an old power structure and substituting it with a new one that maybe is not fully established yet?
It depends. It depends if you're talking about, national presidential politics, where I think there's still a pretty strong possibility that it'll be two old white dudes battling it out for the presidency. Or is it at the local level, where you're seeing more LGBTQ candidates, where you're seeing more people of color candidates, where you're seeing more women running and winning? I do think that that's bubbling up, and that the new generation of leaders is getting their feet wet in city councils and school boards and at the state level, and then eventually that'll move up to the congressional level and maybe the presidency. But I think there's still a pretty solid dominance of old white dudes at the top.
Yeah, in the column I write for the Daily Journal, I've mentioned there's a lot of pent-up ambition locally, because there's some people who have been, present company excluded, of course, but have been dominating the local offices for a long time. And there's this whole new generation of people coming along, isn't there?
Absolutely. And I have been pleasantly surprised at the number of young people in our county, given the cost of living of San Mateo County. These are young people who found their way here, who I think have been inspired to get involved politically, whether it's Trump or other factors. But these are folks in their late 20s, in their 30s, into their 40s. So you do see the next generation coming up locally, but that's also a reflection of what's happening statewide and nationally. The groups like Emerge and Fund Her, and there really has been an awakening in post-2016 American politics about recruitment, getting young women of color in particular, building a farm system. Mm-hmm. And these are the folks that will elevate through the ranks. So yes, you're not seeing it in the most recent debate. There were obviously a couple of women, one Asian candidate. So it's not reflected in the presidential contest yet, right. But it will be. It's inevitable. And you'll see it at the congressional levels, in the leadership of the congressional levels. This demographic change is absolutely going to be reflected in the political power structure, and I think it's a very good thing. Yeah.
I've been teaching for 25 years. Under the Trump administration, I have had so many more students tell me that they're thinking of running for office.
No kidding.
That they're going to go back to their hometown, that they're going to run for city council, that they want to be in the Senate, that they want to run for president. That's new. That did not used to be what college students were talking about in terms of where they wanted to go.
Well, that's generational. There was, when I was in college, which is of course a long time ago, but it's interesting because you would think it would be turning them off to what's going on. Let's talk quickly about the state Senate race. Any thoughts about that? Because it is not, it's sort of like the presidential race in that it is not dominated by any particular individual, which, you know, normally in peninsula politics, somebody's running who's already well enough established that they make it difficult for everybody else. But is this race basically still wide open, Kevin?
Well, I've been struck by how little I've heard about the race. If I was an average voter, I don't know that I would have a sense of what's happening, and we're 2 months, less than 2 months from ballots being received.
Less than 2 months.
So the big question politically is it going to be 2 Democrats at the top for the top 2? Or based on the percentages, will it be the top Democrat versus the one Republican who will get their 18 or 19%, something like that? But will 2 candidates be strong enough on the Democratic side to eclipse that built-in Republican percentage? And then you have a Dem-on-Dem runoff, and that's where things get really interesting. But it's been, candidates I know are working hard, but it's a challenge for them to get the attention that they need to give their candidacies oxygen when I think the narrative is so dominated by what's happening with the impeachment and the presidential contest and the early primary. It's just a real challenge getting noticed. It's just a challenging environment politically this year for that group.
Yeah, I would bet that most folks in the district couldn't even tell you who's running, right? Let alone who they're planning to vote for. So, I mean, again, it's wide open, right? Kind of parallel to the Democratic nomination. It's wide open. Anything could happen because once actually people do tune in and go, okay, I got to vote on this too, right? So who are these people? Then we'll, you know, so anything could happen because at this point, so few people are paying attention that we have no idea.
Okay, we got just a couple of minutes left, and I sent this list out so you guys could prepare because I knew you were going to try and get out of this question, but let's give me your 2020 fearless predictions. What are your top 1, 2, 3 predictions for what's going to happen in 2020?
Well, it says 2, so I like
2 to 5, it says. I'll just take whatever you can get up with now.
Okay.
We've already made a number of fabulous predictions, such
like,
as record turnout.
Okay, that's not exactly what I'm looking for. Who's going to win the presidency? Is Trump going to get reelected?
He might, and I think people really need to, like, prepare themselves.
Yeah.
Pay attention, prepare yourselves. Like, this is a serious thing that might happen.
Who do you think the Democratic nominee will be?
I think the Democratic nominee is going to be Joe Biden.
Yeah, how about you?
So I think the Democratic nominee will, in fact, be Joe Biden, who will sort of ride this out and ride a decent performance on Super Tuesday through the spring. But I do think his age will become an issue because he would be 8 years older than our oldest president to be inaugurated, which was Donald Trump. He was 70, Ronald Reagan was 69. Age will become an issue. Of course, it's a little easier because you're running against a old Republican, but I think he announces a one-term presidency and has Stacey Abrams on the ticket and does it. He's basically a transitional figure and leads to a generational change.
I agree that he will probably nominate Stacey Abrams or somebody like her to be his running mate. I don't think he'll take the one-term pledge. I think he'd put out that feeler this week, maybe. God, time's moving so fast. It was either last week or this week that he kind of floated that and was told, I think very clearly, that's a terrible idea. You should never promise to be a one-term president, right?
But he's getting it into the ether because
that people are thinking of it. Right, so you don't want to do that. You don't want to make the pledge. So I don't think he'll take the pledge, but I do think he'll kind of be saying like, well, I'm the president, but here's my young, black, vibrant woman vice president, and that's going to lead to more excitement and put in people's heads that she will follow him.
And the U.S. Senate will go Democrat based on that.
There you go. There's another prediction. That's it. That's all we've got time for. We've run out of 2019, but we're going to move ahead to 2020. Melissa Michelson, thank you always for being with us. I'm Mark Simon.
And I'm Kevin Mullen.
And thank you for being with us. We'll see you next time on The Game.